called the silent generation, the generation that came of age during the 1950s. Our own chosen place of exile from Middle America was New York, where you found your contemporary counterparts, allies, mentors, friends. Our 50s were far more exciting than the typical American experience because we were in New York, where people came to flee the average and find a group of like-minded souls. New York was the glamour city at that time. It was a place you saw in all the movies where exciting things happened, where people got off the train and immediately went into some great adventure. Nothing dull was ever happening in New York.
It was glamorous. It was the thing in the movies. It was the thing. It was just everything.
New York was the place of acceptance, and of course, adventuresome and industrial and cultured place. So it was the Mecca. It was the place of magic. It was the place of opportunity.
Being in New York in the 50s was really, in our minds, was like being in Paris in the 20s or 30s, when that's where it was happening. All the new stuff was happening there.
New York was the place you went where there was freedom and hope and an edgy, if you could make it there, you could make it anywhere, and that was enormously appealing. And it certainly had a lot to do with why I went.
It defined us because it meant we were not going to stay home and marry the girl next door and go into the corporate life and get the gold watch at retirement. We had decided to take risks, and we had come to New York to try to do our best, to be the best we could be in whatever it was.
Those of us who came to New York came because we wanted freedom from the sameness of life where we were living, or we wanted to experience a broader cultural base.
Where the eyes can rest, the blood refresh itself. Thank you.
Once you got to New York, you were sort of deculturated. You were already freer than you would have been at home because you were freed from your background.
Manhattan was everything. It was life, it was glamour, it was excitement, it was art, it was money, it was sex, and especially we wanted that.
And it was a city in which they described beautiful women, and they also described women of great liberal sexual inclinations, and that appealed to me, even though at that time I hadn't known any woman of any liberal inclinations at all.
The thing about New York in the 50s is that we felt that, you know, Eisenhower America out there in the great heartland was just this sort of suffocating tranquility. But in New York City, things were really boiling and bubbling.
New York was where you got started, and that was on my mind, to get started. That was the 50s for me. It was getting a toehold, presumptuous to say, but to break out of the pack and, you know, get your voice heard and let people know who you were, if you were indeed anyone, you know.
So I came with great expectations, and I arrived in 1955 to stay. E.B. White said, you know, anyone who comes to New York to stay should be willing to be lucky. I guess at that age, we're all willing to be lucky if we come to stay, and I was very hopeful about that.
My parents always knew, at least my father, that I wasn't coming home.
We didn't always find a dream, but it was full of glitter and enticements, and it was where everything was happening.
There's no doubt in my mind that the 50s is the most underrated decade, underrated period, and particularly because everybody had this image of the 50s being the Eisenhower age, and what they forget is that the 50s was also the people who came to New York to escape the Eisenhower age. New York was like the alternative society.
I think that's the definition of the 50s almost. You could be in New York an individual. You couldn't be an actor the way you could by the 60s, but by God, you could make your statement here.
I really wanted something different from Indiana and from the very middle-class kind of existence I'd had up till then. So even though there was a lot of static with the family, I still had to go.
Another danger everyone felt was if, from the Midwest anyway, if you went to New York, you might become a communist, because that was where all the radical ideas emanated, and strange people and ideas and all different cultures met and mingled, and so you had to watch out.
Dan and I really didn't know each other in high school, but we both wound up in New York at the same time, and that was terrific because we both wanted to be writers.
We wanted to be part of this exciting, creative thing that was going on in New York in the 50s, where everybody was expressing themselves, finding new ways to express themselves.
When Dan and I first became friends, we both had arrived at a place where, sort of like the Fitzgerald quote, we were a generation to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken, and we sort of lived by that. Wake and I moved into an apartment together in the Village at 10th Street and Bleecker. It was a 6-story apartment, so we called it, laughingly, the Towers.
And parties on the roof, where you weren't supposed to go, but we had a great view of the lights of Manhattan.
I remember drinking, and I remember parties, always parties. Maybe because, you know, I arrived on weekends, and there was the time for the party. And books, piles of books. Then the fire escape. I remember a fire escape, and I remember people sitting on the fire escape.
And we had access to the roof through the fire escape, and that was cool because we'd go up on the roof and look out over the city and say, this is ours, or one day will be.
I remember the very first time I went to Greenwich Village. I was still at Columbia, and a student from New York took me to Sheridan Square, which for many of us was the heart of the village. But I remember the very first time I went there, feeling this wonderful, strange, this was something new. I mean, there was no such place like this in Indiana.
You could just go stand out on the street and watch the world go by and talk to people, listen to people, sit down for 25 cents in those days and have a cup of coffee and get an education, or go to a bar and have one glass of wine and learn about painting and poetry and music and sports. There was romance, there was fun, and a sense of community. And that's all anyone in the world could ask for.
The community was a community of people who were doing what you were doing, and so you didn't feel strange. You felt what you were doing to spend most of your day writing poetry seemed perfectly sensible.
Greenwich Village was still, when I got to New York, had an allure. It was the place to go to be off-center, it was the place to go to be free and be whatever you wanted to be, and it had a bohemian atmosphere, and it was very attractive.
The different kinds of people and the different kinds of dress and style, and thinking, wow, this is, I guess, where they have free love, and this is where they have bohemians and intellectuals and writers and dancers, and it was a thrilling place.
One thing I loved about the village was socializing, going from bar to bar, meeting different types of people, sorts of people. They were great. They were just absolutely great bars.
I used to hang out at a number of places, the White Horse Tavern and the Cedar Tavern. The White Horse was my favorite because the arguments there were so fierce about everything, race, politics, whatever. But as fierce as they weren't the kind of arguments that resulted in people never speaking to each other again. It was enjoyable to argue.
And also it was a place where you mixed people, different classes, different races. It was just a wonderful, different world.
Washington Square was the great meeting ground. There was a huge central fountain in the middle of it, and it often wasn't running. And people sat there with their legs over the empty fountain, almost in a kind of mass meeting. You would run into anybody there at that point. Nowhere else in the city could that happen.
The Village was just a meeting place, almost like a magnet, a nerve center, a soul center.
I actually started my place, the Village Gate, 1958, with folk music. And I wasn't sure what kind of entertainment I would have, but folk music, I mean, that's what was really happening. Where would Bob Dylan have gone, really, from Hibbing, Minnesota, except to come down to Greenwich Village, and that's where he started his career. And so did many others.
The Village was a center for people like Ginsberg and Kerouac and Jimmy Baldwin and all of these people, people we knew from the Village scene.
Really, that was why I chose the Village, because it was a village. You could walk around the streets of the Village and see people you knew. And there was a sense of, we're all in this together, almost like being on a college campus. It was a very nice feeling.
The Village was jumping. There were a lot of young people, mostly from the war, veterans from the war, and other people from all over America coming to the Village. And a lot of people were writers and artists and creative people. And rents were very low in those days. So it was a very heady mix of very exciting young people interested in doing things. And that's the foundation for what happened in the 50s when we started the Village Voice.
The Village Voice was like the right paper at the right time at the right place. It was a writer's paper, and the Village was full of writers.
The Voice in the 50s started out as a true community newspaper. I don't think we covered much above 110th Street, if that. My wife Margot had a phrase for it at that time. It was a community of consciousness.
We wanted a paper that would be very open to a diversity of different points of view, and particularly open to young writers. And we had a whole different philosophy of what journalism ought to be, that it ought to be much more casual, much more reflecting the experiences of the writers.
The Village Voice in those days had an office on Sheridan Square, which was about 4 or 5 blocks from where I lived. And I would often just go over there and hang out. Dan Wolfe was the editor, Ed Fancher the publisher, and it was a very welcoming place to writers.
It was an unbelievably new, rich, varied possibility, and Norman Mailer was going to write in it. And Norman Mailer was the hero of the age as far as we were concerned.
Mailer wrote a column for about 3 months in the Village Voice every week. And in this column, he insulted everybody. He insulted particularly Greenwich Village and called them a bunch of phonies. He criticized the Village Voice. He generally raised bloody hell.
Women's liberation is two things. It is a profoundly political movement, and it's a profoundly sexual movement, which quite naturally takes on huge lesbian overtones. That does not mean at all that every woman who's interested in women's liberation is a lesbian. Obviously not. Anyone who would go ahead and say, I then said that, is a fool. But what I am saying...
I think his great contribution was more in the realm of promotion and of what a writer could do. Up to that point, writers were supposed to be very timid, obedient characters. Mailer broke that image.
Because the whole question of how much liberty men and women can find with each other, and how much sharing of those dishes that they can do goes into the center of everything. And I'd like the discussion to go at that level. I'm perfectly willing. If you wish me to act the clown, I will take out my modest little Jewish dick and put it on the table. You can all spit at it and laugh at it, and then I'll walk away and you'll find it was just a dildo I left there. I hadn't shown you the real one.
He did write a great deal about orgasm, and a famous article he did called The White Negro, and which stimulated one of my favorite controversies of the period, which I thought of as the great orgasm debate, because Mailer, in his article in Dissent magazine, said that people in analysis had the worst orgasms because they were really middle class and repressed, and that the best orgasms were of hipsters, people like himself.
He was sort of off the wall about that stuff, you know, that hipsters had the great orgasms and people in analysis had puny orgasms. I mean, you know, the evidence was non-existent. What you call the great orgasm debate, the very fact that it could take place in print in the mid-50s was in and of itself a breakthrough.
So I'm not here to say that every woman must have a child, or every woman must have a vaginal orgasm, or that every woman must conceive in any way that I lay down. Anyone who says that about me just doesn't know how to read my sentences.
From what I got from, you know, some of the women, these hipsters did not have great orgasms, but often were very premature, you know, very narcissistic.
Well, Norman Mailer was a phenomenon. A brilliant writer. He required equal attention to himself as to his work, so the opposite of Salinger.
In my case, and in many of my friends, Mailer was the one who dominated what we call the cutting edge now. We simply called it the wave, the direction in which things were rolling. We were all hugely interested in reporting. We didn't want to report in order to move on to the next thing. We wanted to do the best reporting you could possibly do and make a difference, not just a stylistic change in the country. The differences came in the 60s, but the guys who were trying to make those differences, to set them up, were in the 50s. That was our ambition.
Women writers were different. Yeah, they were treated differently. They weren't really in the game.
When I was at Random House, what women did was children's books, cookbooks, and mysteries.
And I will never forget to this day my reception by the personnel, which they now call Human Resources. She asked if I was married. I said yes. And she said, well, if you're married, you might have a baby. I said, yes, but I'm not planning to. I was still pretty young, and we had no money. She said, yes, but you might, and it's too risky to hire you. And that was how I did not start my career in publishing.
There was an expectation that we would work until we got married, and then we would have children, and we would stop working, and we would raise the children and be good wives.
What does the emancipation of American women mean to you?
Emancipation?
Yeah, liberation, etc. How about women's right to stand up on buses and streetcars?
Oh, Betty, be serious. Talk about emancipation. Take the family wash, for instance. No more clotheslines, no more Blue Mondays. Boy, here's real emancipation from old-fashioned chores. Just set a dial and walk away.
I would say women writers were perceived as a lesser breed, kind of an offshoot or an adjunct. Even in the Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac days, even then the women who hung out with them were not equals.
Their rebellion was really a male phenomenon. That women, very few women were directly involved in it. It was the 50s, and it was more or less of a boys' club.
It was so much a man's world, and you just didn't want to step into a territory, if you wanted to be in that territory, you never wanted to call attention to yourself that you were there. So I just sort of quietly did the work, and as long as I didn't bring attention to myself to them, they were all perfectly happy.
When I started working there, time was rather rigidly organized in its structure. There were writers in New York, there were correspondents in the field, and there were editors and researchers in New York. So what was called Time Edit was made up of a hierarchy of editors, writers, and researchers. All of the editors and all of the writers were male, and all of the researchers were female. So try to imagine now a news magazine, a national news magazine, having a rigidly divided by gender table of organization. We're saying, no, you can be the most brilliant writer in the world, but you're going to have to be a researcher because you're a woman, a girl.
It changed little by little, but it was, women were not the same. I mean, you only have to look at some of the things Norman Mailer said in the 60s and 70s about women's writing and women, the idea of women writing. You know, you write with your balls, so how can women write?
In New York in the 50s, the predominant cultural force was the word, not the image. People were readers. We were there because we read. We were there because we shared stories of books and characters.
People in the reading club took what we were doing very seriously. Discussions would get very heated. It meant a lot to them.
The characters in people's books, they were important to us. That's what people talked about. I mean, you would read a book and then you'd sit and thrash it out. And they definitely formed our culture the way music formed, I think, the 60s, you could say.
The conversation that you had privately or in groups included the characters that you had read about. And I don't get the sense of that at all anymore. I think more people talk about movies, but they don't talk about it in terms of characters. They talk about it in terms of actors.
And we knew about the people. I mean, we knew about how they'd written their books and what their private lives were like, and how they come apart, and how Fitzgerald had come apart at the seams. And it seemed very romantic and very intense, and that definitely colored the way that we were living our lives. We thought that that was part of really living.
We all loved the French book, The Woman Who Was Poor by Leon Bloy. And he discusses the fact that there's like a small band of kindred spirits that roam the world. And we felt like that.
This is an age of writers. Our heroes were writers. We wanted to be writers. There was no question that that was the ultimate destination for our careers.
Of course, in New York in the 50s, the hero of everyone who wanted to who aspired to be a writer was Salinger.
Salinger was by far the greatest literary influence of the 50s over members of that generation, particularly disaffected members of that generation. He was a kind of harbinger of what was to come in the 60s.
Jack Kerouac tapped the popular vein, and Salinger did. Salinger was, well, both those writers were quite good, I thought, but they also, their characters, it might be more accurate to say, spoke the common language of their time, especially of young people.
I think each generation or decade had its voice for the condition of the time. And Salinger, I think, was the strongest voice we had.
We used to rush out to find his latest New Yorker story whenever it came out, and of course, Catcher in the Rye was the book that we all thought of as our Bible.
It was a story of a kid like me, let's say, from a middle-class family, having a little ambition to be different, to go out, see the world, and getting into trouble, but with soul.
He was against the world in ways that people in their 20s were also against the world.
I think really important writers aren't better than other writers. They're just more, more honest, and they say the unsayable. They say what most of us think. And this was ferociously honest.
He spoke to the pain we felt, to the confusion we felt, to the misunderstanding we felt. And he did so with this kind of brilliant, edgy wit that was always, I mean, everything was always on the brink of suicide. And that felt right, you know.
Well, in the 1950s, if you were a writer or an aspiring writer, you were expected to drink. People who could hold their liquor well were admired. All the great writers of the 20th century, so many of them were heavy drinkers. Hemingway and Faulkner are most obvious cases.
Not only was it okay to get smashed, there was a tradition of Nobel Prize winners like Sinclair Lewis, and Hemingway hadn't won his yet, but he was a lush. Faulkner was a lush.
Some of my heroes were drinking writers. Irwin Shaw was one I mentioned on many occasions, and John O'Hara I mentioned before. Both heavy drinkers.
I'll never forget being taken the first time to the White Horse Tavern in the Village, and some of the regulars led me to the sacred table where Dylan Thomas had had his last drink. And they said, oh, here it is, where the great Dylan Thomas had his last drink before he passed out, was taken across the street to St. Vincent's Hospital, and died of alcoholism at age 39. I go, wow, that's fabulous. I mean, you know, like that was what you were to aspire to.
So it was okay to overindulge. It was, in fact, necessary. Even the stupid things that came out of your mouth when you were drunk, even the hangovers, even the suffering, certainly the suffering was part of what you had to do to be a writer, and you certainly suffered if you drank too much.
Yeah, everybody drank. I mean, it was a drinking culture in those days. I started working at the Times in '57, and you know, I was with a group of people. We went out for 3 martini lunches, and then I would have because I'm Jewish, I would have a sandwich afterwards. The WASP drinkers wouldn't eat, you know, they'd just come back and edit.
Well, there were editors all over town who had the reputation of people you better get to in the morning rather than in the afternoon, or some of them, depending on what liquor did to them, maybe better to get to them in the afternoon when they're more amenable to practically anything.
We were told, if you want to be a serious writer, you have to be a serious drinker. That was just understood.
This is when you drank after work. You'd leave work and go someplace and have a drink, and they'd have drinks for 50 cents. You think, wow, my God. And so you'd sit there and you'd be pissed to your eyeballs.
We didn't have 12-step programs at that time. There was not much help. Drinking and smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day was considered not only to be socially acceptable, but a sign of manliness, sign of being a groovy person.
Your cigarette's not tasting cool enough till you come up to cool. Feel extra coolness in your throat as cool comes through for you. Cool enough? Perfect. You're not smoking cool, cool, cool enough till you come up to cool.
Drinking was just part of the texture of life in general. I mean, it wasn't just writers. It was across the board. People who worked in offices, people who worked for advertising agencies. I worked for a fashion magazine. People would routinely have a drink at lunch.
I think a lot of people worked after a lot of drinking. I tended to fall asleep.
When I moved to California in 1964, I was amazed at how I felt in the afternoon. And then I realized that I'd had a low-level hangover for years. I mean, because I would go out to lunch and routinely have a drink, and so then you would feel a little low at 4 o'clock. And the absence of that feeling was so novel to me that I mean, I just thought it was a normal way of feeling.
I feel as if the sexual liberation that took place in the 60s, that the 60s are famous for, really started in the 50s. And as a matter of fact, I think it started in the summer of 1955 with Rock Round the Clock. That's what got us moving. When we get music that anybody can dance to, and you don't have to know steps or anything like that, and you start moving your body, things start to happen.
The period of the 50s as a time of sexual repression is not at all true. In the realm of the New York Times City Room, there was more sex going on in the City Room then than there is going in the Oval Office at any time.
Mailer was in pursuit of the ultimate orgasm. I was in pursuit of any orgasm.
The big questions of the 50s, why do I have so much anxiety and how can I get rid of it? What is an orgasm and how will I know when I have one? After all this faking?
I found the sex life of the City Room the most shocking at first and then endearing afterwards of my experience. I mean, the fact that the New York Times was almost like a vast massage parlor. I mean, it had affairs going on every floor of the 14-story building. I mean, the first floor would be the advertising people, and the advertising people were pretty notorious. The three martini lunch guys of the 1950s were hitting on and scoring with half the women on the floor.
I remember another friend from Columbia who had had the same problem I had had with trying to go to bed with a woman he loved and not being able to perform. And he said after I told about this, my failure sexually at one of the sessions, and I was the youngest guy in the group, and two of the older men, when they knew that I had having a date with the same girl again, they took me out and bought me 2 martinis. And then I went to see the girl, and we made love, and it was just fine. I said, my God, man, it was the 2 martinis, you know, it wasn't the therapy.
In the 50s, one difference between then and now was the much greater role that psychoanalysis played in our conversations, in our lives. Everybody tried to have some kind of shrink or other.
It was the religion of the 50s. We believed in it. We felt that we were neurotic, and we felt that we were entitled to be happy.
Psychoanalysis in the 50s in New York, that was its most powerful, influential time. Everybody talked about it. Everybody was either in it or wanted to be in it or had their partner, their friend, their lover was in it.
A young woman came up for an editorial job, and she's very attractive in every way. But she said that she would have to come in an hour late each day because she was seeing a psychiatrist. Well, in my head, that marked her down. It's kind of sexy for one thing to be seeing, because what kind of problems is she having is going on in my head? Obviously, sexual stuff.
Mailer had a very good point about psychoanalysis. He said if you went to bed with a woman who was in analysis, it was like there were 3 people in the bed. There was the man, the woman, and the analyst. So I guess in my case, there were 4 people in the bed, because if I were with a woman in analysis, I was in an analysis too. Right out of college, I met a girl that I was really madly in love with, and I wanted to marry her. And I remember the great moment for me was when we found that we could actually do it in the bathtub. I couldn't wait to get to the psychoanalyst the next day and report. I figured this meant the analysis was going to end early. And the doctor, as he always did, the only thing he ever said was, yes, go on. And I said, well, wait a minute. I actually sat up on the couch, and I said, well, doesn't this mean, you know, I'm cured? And he said, oh, no. He said, that's just a symptom. Had I really been smart, I'd have just right then said, well, that's the symptom I'm interested in, and left. But I went on. I think it was not really the analysis that enabled me to finally begin to enjoy sex, but it was the patience and love of women who were very understanding of clumsy guilt-ridden, terrified Midwestern Boy Scouts like myself.
So here he is, Jack Kerouac.
I think a lot of cultural events of the 60s really had their roots in the 50s.
How would you define the word beat? I don't mean why not time, I mean, really, is there...
sympathetic.
Sympathetic?
Of course, many of the writers, Mailer, Ginsberg, Kerouac, that whole group were really getting going in the 50s.
The great image of God with forefinger pointed straight at me through halos and rolls and gold folds that were like the existence of a gleaming spear in his right hand, which saith, "Come on, boy, go thou across the ground. Go moan for man. Go moan. Go groan. Go groan alone."
Jack I met in 1956, and we used to go to the Bring Your Own Bottle loft parties, and we would sit there and just play together. He had the ability to improvise on the spot. He could improvise words or music about anything. We never dreamed that that was going to start a whole trend like the hula hoops, where suddenly that and the word beatnik and beat culture would suddenly become such an enormous thing.
People have a very different impression now about the role of the Beats in New York in the 50s. People now, I think that was the whole scene. It was actually a minor part of the scene. And a lot of the writers, respected writers at the time, were not enamored of Kerouac's work, of On the Road.
I was never that knocked out by the Beats as a literary movement, but I liked what they stood for. I think I was put off by the fact that the writing was so bad usually, except for Ginsberg, because we all thought, gee, you know, anyone can just sit down and just pour out exactly what they're thinking. And that certainly wasn't the sculpted writing of a Salinger or a Hemingway.
I think the main difference is with the other 50s writers is that they had the spiritual dimension. Paradoxically, even though they were known as sort of decadent thrill seekers, you know, looking for kicks and so forth, what they were really looking for was ecstasy and the exploration of consciousness. They said, life should be exciting. Every moment should be lived. I think that was Jack's gift.
I did admire Ginsberg and his work, and came to admire it much more even later, and realized that a lot of the poems in the book Howl, not just Howl itself, but some of the poems in there were really the kind of things about Buddhism and about a certain understanding of life, the kind of things I didn't get to for 25 years. And Ginsberg was understanding and writing about back in the 50s.
Their language was much more spontaneous, much less academic. Spontaneity was a really important, almost a religious tenet with them. Jack had a quotation somewhere, when the hand writes, if you go back and erase, it's a sin. First thought, best thought.
I thought that what the Beat poets really had to say was that America had reached a time, or they had reached a time, when they could be who they were, that they could be the individuals that America had always talked about, that they could express themselves as they wanted to. Nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. Think of Dean Moriarty, I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. Think of Dean Moriarty, I think of Dean Moriarty.
In music at that time in the 1950s, America was still segregated, not officially, except in the South, but socially. and even worse mentally and spiritually.
Miles Davis, whom no one would dare call an Uncle Tom or he'd get his head knocked off, Miles hired Bill Evans, a white player, pianist, and he got a lot of heat from black musicians. You know, a lot of our guys need that work. And Miles came up with what I thought was one of the best lines of the times. I don't care if he's green or purple so long as he can play.
In music, you are no longer white, black, nationality, race, sex, age. You are out there in a very pure, for real world. And if you can play your horn, that's all that matters. Jazz was one of the great things in this century that reminded America and the world that we had some geniuses that were so healthy that they could overcome racism. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, the whole history of jazz, and the white people that participated and made their contributions too. All of us were able to transcend that and be part of something beautiful called this great 20th century music.
To me, that whole period comes most alive when I remember the Basie band, the band that played with an enormous amount of power. The ensemble playing was brilliant. And that band would hit you as like you were going into a furnace, a blast of heat.
I think that there's nowhere on the earth at this point that the music that was created here, that we call jazz, has not had a profound influence.
It really connected with everything that was going on. If you think of jazz in the freewheeling spirit, it was like the abstract expressionists in painting. It was like the beats. It was like what Allen Ginsberg was doing in poetry.
The beat poets that came out of it regularly referred to jazz as their source and the things that they responded to and the thing that they looked to. Kerouac certainly was a jazz writer.
I think many of us, musicians, artists, writers, poets, painters, were inspired by one another.
I don't think that one could easily deny the effect and the reality that this music has had on the literature, and especially on the painting. Jackson Pollock was known to have listened to jazz all the time when he worked. His work was totally improvisational, which has been, for me, Jackson Pollock is the first American painter, truly American painter, because he dealt with truly American issues: space, freedom, expression, and most importantly, the improvisation, the giving up, the blowing apart of the traditions and the norms as America was about at the time.
Another great influence of that era was James Baldwin. And I had read his book, Notes of a Native Son, which just electrified me, and particularly the autobiographical introduction. And he ended up saying his aim and goal, he said, "I want to be an honest man and a good writer." And I thought, wow, what better goal could one have?
I think it's Dan who introduced me to James Baldwin in The White Horse. And I remember when I was at college, I read the essay about being in prison in Paris, and I remember weeping in my apartment reading that essay. I was very impressed with, I was very moved by his work.
When I first read James Baldwin, which was in the 40s rather than the 50s, it was, and some of my friends, this was when we were undergraduates at Columbia, there was a huge debate as to whether or not this guy was a Negro, as that was the word used then. Some people thought he must be because of the subject matter. He was writing about Harlem and so on, but no one had ever read anything like this.
I'm a writer, and I know I'm a Negro. I'm an American Negro, but that means that that's a title or a label or a way of defining a person which is imposed on one from above. I'm an American Negro in the eyes of the American Republic. Now later on, of course, I had to become an American Negro in my own eyes, which is a very different matter. But I don't think that one can be labeled ultimately this way.
Well, James Baldwin came through like a thunderbolt, not only in New York, but all over the country. I mean, he was known to people who had read his stuff and who had heard him speak. He really was a preacher. I mean, in the sense of the black preacher with the dynamics and all that. He really was something. Even in conversation, he could be like that.
If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now?
But he wrote a piece for The New Yorker, which was The Fire Next Time, which later became the book. And that, I mean, he didn't say anything that was new, but he said it with such fire and depth and anger about the state of black consciousness and conditions in the United States, that was a pivotal kind of piece of writing.
I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children.
He didn't so much change people's minds at first as he entered their minds and made them think about it.
Baldwin was the first black writer who made the issue of race come alive for his white readers, because he talked about it in language we all use. And to that extent, he made many more people aware earlier than they might otherwise have been of the importance of this issue.
This was a time of very early civil rights. There was a lot of tension between blacks and whites, and there was also a lot of camaraderie. You couldn't separate them.
People gathered around James Baldwin. He was very magnetic. I used to go over to his apartment on Horatio Street in the afternoon and drink bourbon with him and listen to Bessie Smith records. And by around 6 or 7 o'clock, there'd be maybe 8 or 10 people there.
Everybody was sitting around, all the white people, with this kind of deference and worship and fear, and he was slightly hostile, but that was okay. It was very, very tangled and delicate situation. And he was sounding off about racial injustice, and very well. And we were all feeling guilty.
He was always torn between his public self and his writing self. And he, of course, felt a great responsibility to the civil rights movement. He was always being called upon, and yet he felt an even greater responsibility to be a writer. After being at Howard University, he said he had met this old professor who said to him, "Just remember, son, the important thing is when you end up, you want to have a shelf of books, a whole shelf." And I remember Baldwin looking at me then like he was passing it on, and he says, "Remember, baby, a shelf of books, a whole shelf."
No living man may know it till this hour, when the clear sun stream, thickening to amber, moves like a sea, and the sunk hulls of houses let it come slowly through, as divers clamber, feeling for gold. So now into this room peer the large eyes, unopened to their doom.
The real thing that prompted me to go to New York and to go to Columbia was reading an essay of Mark Van Doren. And it was thrilling to read that he had this idea that you could be educated simply by reading the great books of the world. And I finished the essay and it said, Mark Van Doren is a Pulitzer Prize poet who teaches at Columbia. And it was like his name came up off the page like a message. And I thought, that's where I'm going to go.
I don't think you should expect poetry to make things happen in the world. I shouldn't think it ever did anything more than remind us of what the world already is.
He taught a course called Don Quixote. That's all it was called. He hardly ever talked about Don Quixote. It was always just about life. And you'd sit there in his course just rapt because he would just talk about things. Everything was a brilliant insight, one after another.
You have more extraordinary pieces of information hidden away in your hollow teeth than anybody I know.
Well, my wife told me that.
Mark Van Doren, who was a Pulitzer Prize poet, nationally famous writer, speaker, lecturer. I walked into his office. I was as welcomed as a freshman as any other Pulitzer Prize poet would have been welcome. At a time when I was extremely in revolt against my early religious upbringing and against Christianity, in the narrative art course, Van Doren lectured on the New Testament. And it was so powerful. And he wasn't trying to convert anybody. He was simply trying to take it as literature and to take Jesus seriously. And I'll never forget, he said, you know, a lot of you grew up in Sunday schools where you got the idea that Jesus was a kind of wispy character floating around Jerusalem in a nightshirt. And he says, but that's not true. He said, Jesus was the most ruthless of men. And I just, you know, it was like an electric shock. You know, I'd never heard that before. And it made it interesting. It made me see this from a whole different point of view.
Lightning, I mean, and eagles, fences, snow, sunrise and ferns, waterfalls, serpents, green islands, and sleep. Stop, lie still, you will never be done. Leave them all there, old lover, live on.
Another of the great professors at Columbia, who was also very nationally known and important, was C. Wright Mills, the sociologist.
I never met C. Wright Mills, but I sure was aware of his writing. I mean, those were the days actually when, much more than today, there were professors who spoke truth to power, to use the Quaker phrase, but he did it with such force and such knowledge. I mean, he didn't just give you his opinions, he gave you the whole background, but did it with a lucidity and I must say grace as well. And I think he influenced not only his own students at Columbia, but a lot of other people as well, including me.
I think the greatest lesson of Mills was not any specific thing about sociology or about politics. He loved what he called taking it big. He didn't like the whole academic focus on some little aspect of something. He wanted you to look at the world. He wanted you to take it big in the biggest sense. I've always felt that if I hadn't gone to Columbia, if I hadn't left Indiana, I would have probably ended up being the assistant sports editor of the Chicago Tribune and a leading Republican in Midwestern circles. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of those fates, but they certainly weren't my fate, and they aren't a fate I would now feel comfortable with. Going to Columbia was just, I can't imagine anything more exciting or more, that more totally shaped my life and my work. Murray Kempton was the hero of almost every young writer I knew in New York in the 50s. He wrote a column for the New York Post, and I met Murray when I was working briefly in a weekly paper in Princeton, New Jersey, where he lived, and I reviewed his first book called Part of Our Time, Some Monuments and Ruins of the 1930s. And then, in fact, he engineered my first magazine assignment, which was to cover the Emmett Till murder trial in 1955 for The Nation magazine. The crowds are gone, and this Delta town is back to its silent, solid life that is based on cotton and the proposition that a whole race of men was created to pick it. Citizens who drink from the whites-only fountain in the courthouse breathe much easier now that the two fair-skinned half-brothers, ages 24 and 36, have been acquitted of the murder of a 14-year-old Negro boy.
When I saw my story in The Nation magazine with my byline, the first thing I did was to go to the United Cigar Store on Sheridan Square and buy up all the copies of The Nation so that I could send them to my friends and my parents. And I read the story over and over, just amazed that I had written it and that it was there in print. And I felt like, well, now I've done it. Now I am a writer. I can continue to be a writer. One of the things I mainly think about when I think about New York in the 50s was the sense of community. And it was not just among writers. There was an idealism that, was represented by Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. Young women and men from across the country who had gone there because they wanted to do something meaningful that really had some impact on society, had some impact on people's lives.
The Catholic worker, for me, represented the cross of my two biggest interests, which were the church and this working for peace through nonviolence.
I guess it was just the influence, the collective influence and energy that people get when they're inspired by other people, and there's a community of feeling and friendship, and you have the feeling that it's that you're a special group, and you're willing to dedicate your life to what you think is right and what you want to do, and maybe change the world in some small way.
I was very impressed and very moved by these young people. And some of these young women I met there, 3 of them had become friends through their volunteer work at the Catholic Worker, and wanting to do more and being inspired by the kind of work Dorothy Day did, they decided to go to East Harlem and open up a daycare center for the children. And one of these young women was named Mary Ann McCoy, and I was quite taken with her charm and beauty and enthusiasm and her idealism.
I thought he was an extremely exciting person. And plus that, he was a reporter. He was a great journalist. He was covering stories for the nation.
She invited me to come up to 100th Street in East Harlem and have dinner with her and the 2 other young women, and I did. And I was just overwhelmed with this scene, with the life on 100th Street, which was so rich and so different than anything I'd ever seen. And from these 3 young women being accepted there and being loved.
These Catholic worker young women came and started living there, and my memory is not as good as Dan's, but he appeared on the scene because he knew them, and he was willing to stick around. And clearly this was a different type of writer or journalist because he seemed to care for people.
We thought it was very romantic to be in East Harlem. And plus the block was not just black, it was Spanish, half black. These kids had nothing. We went up and we began spending our entire Sundays there with the kids, taking them to the parks, taking them to the museums. Then we finally rented a storefront on 101st Street and 2nd Avenue, La Casita de San Jose, the Little House of St. Joseph. And we opened it up as a big playroom.
And seeing these people from the Catholic Worker and from the parish was very inspiring to me, and I really was impressed. I admired them. Also, I wanted to be admired by Mary Ann.
I think we nicked a lot at parties, Dan and I, but I didn't go all the way.
If it had not been for Mary Ann, I probably would have never even gone up to East Harlem. And once having gone up, I got hooked not only on Mary Ann, but on the neighborhood as a subject to write about. And I ended up getting a room there and living there for about 6 months and writing the book, Island in the City.
It is easy to see the beginnings of things and harder to see the ends. I can remember now with a clarity that makes the nerves in the back of my neck constrict when New York began for me. But I cannot lay my finger on the moment it ended. I can never cut through the ambiguities and second starts and broken resolves to the exact place on the page where the heroine is no longer as optimistic as she once was.
I felt I had grown stale on New York. I'd been there since I went to Columbia in 1952, then I'd lived in the Village since graduating in 55. It was now 1962. I decided I wanted to leave New York. I went to see another mentor and professional friend, Harold Hayes, who was the editor of Esquire. He said, well, apply for a Nieman Fellowship in journalism. It gives you a free year at Harvard. So I said, wow, well, that's a great idea. And this was at that time toward the end of the psychoanalysis when I was getting more and more upset. I was drinking more and more. The night before this committee was to meet, I had a big party, which itself was a stupid thing to do. You should have, one thought you would want to be fresh for such a crucial event. But I had this big party. I drank enormously. I found one of my friends in the bathroom kissing the woman that I had brought to the party. I just went berserk. I told everybody to get the hell out.
Wake and I used to talk about his different problems from time to time. I just thought it was the girl of the moment or the relationship of the moment. But I always thought that it was deeply entrenched in his Indiana youth and background too.
And I ended up even drinking further and cutting my wrist. And I woke up the next morning and I thought, oh my God, this is the day of the Nieman Fellowship interview. And here I've blown it. I've ruined whatever chances I had. I was in such a self-destructive mood that I actually cut my wrist. I mean, this is hopeless. And in this desperation, I called up one of my dearest friends, Jane Wiley, and I said, as I've said to her before and since on other occasions, help.
When I got there, he obviously wanted the Nieman, and so the great situation was, we were trying to figure out, first of all, how to hide the fact that he'd slit his wrist, and also get him from this point where he was in this apartment to a point where he could walk into an interview room. And it was an amazing moment because, of course, he was such a good writer, and it was like throwing it away.
I said, look, I've blown it. The Nieman Committee interview is this afternoon at, I think, 2 o'clock, and look at me. And she said, don't worry, we'll do it. And she threw me in the shower and then got me to eat and then dressed the wound. And then the final act was that there had to be a bandage over the wrist, but she fixed the sleeve of my shirt, put a pin in it so that it would not betray the fact that I had done this. And then I went before the committee, knowing that I was held together with pins and bandages, and I was brilliant. And I answered all the committee's questions, and a couple weeks later found out I had gotten the fellowship.
I think that in this city, it was an amazing time because there were so many interesting people. It couldn't have been better. And we all thought we had the world. I mean, we had the world in our hand. I don't think people feel that anymore.
I don't know that it will ever have the excitement for me that it had then because of the age I was and my lack of experience and my energy and passion. And I'm here where I can do anything, I can be anything I want, I can do anything I want, nothing's going to stop me. That kind of energy, you don't carry that all your life.
But people were kind of drifting off. There was a feeling of we weren't quite getting the good of this anymore. It was maybe time to move on.
What had always been an alternative to the status quo suddenly disappeared. The alternative also became a status quo. Both the left and the right became big business. And as a result, there seemed to be no place for any of us.
All the excitement, the artistic endeavors, the individualism, the breakouts seemed to have come to something of a dead end.
The hipsters and the beats were both concerned to write fiction and poetry. Hippies, much less so. They turned to, their talents were devoted rather to rock music and psychedelic light shows and the crafting of exotic hash pipes and, you know, things of that sort.
The real thing that changed, and I can't actually give you the date, was activism.
For the survival of the people of Vietnam.
When instead of sort of flying under the radar and getting things done, when students and people began banding together and demonstrating, which at first seemed rather rude, and I want my rights.
It had to do with the music changing. The 50s were ballroom dancing with a partner. The 60s were the twist. Something very important happened there when people started really moving their bodies. And a woman didn't have to have a partner. Wow, what a revolutionary concept. She could dance with herself. She could dance with the whole room. The 50s were more about alcohol and jazz. The 60s were more about psychedelics or hallucinogens and rock and roll. But actually, I think the real death knell of the 50s was November 22nd, 1963. That felt to me like the beginning of the end of our innocence.
Kennedy getting shot had the whole town crying. And the Beatles, I would say that those, you know, they all came one right after the other. And then the world changed.
I met Kerouac at Ginsberg's apartment. It was turned out it was a historic day. Ginsberg told me that a psychologist from Harvard, Dr. Timothy Leary, and that he was conducting a scientific experiment to give drugs. This drug was supposed to help people creatively. And Ginsberg asked if I'd like some. I said, no, I'll just be the objective reporter. And so he had introduced me to Larry, who was this very eager, crew-cut young guy at the time. And Larry said, oh, this drug is so wonderful. It's very creative. And he said, besides that, it makes people very mellow. He says, you know, take Kerouac. He's often very angry. And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, well, go talk to him now. He's over there, and you'll see how mellow he is because of taking this drug called psilocybin. So I went over and I said, Jack, hello, I'm Dan Wakefield. And Kerouac looks at me and he says, oh, yeah, didn't you write a big bad piece about me in The Nation? And I said, no, it was in Commentary. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I'd like to throw you out that window. So I went back over to Ginsberg and I said, I don't think the drug has taken effect. After being at Howard University, he said he had met this old professor who said to him, just remember, son, the important thing is when you end up, you want to have a shelf of books, a whole shelf. And I remember Baldwin looking at me then like he was passing it on, and he says, remember, baby, a shelf of books, a whole shelf.